Hello, and welcome to Tutoring with Leah. Also, in this video, I give you several examples that allow you to put the explanations into practical use and can help you really well in your exams, in your homework, and in your studying. Alright, so there are two types of compounds. One is ionic. So ionic compounds are made up of one metal and one nonmetal, okay? And whether an element is a metal or a nonmetal can be seen from the periodic table, right? So from here, we can see whether, from the key, that most of the elements are metals, right? So this whole area, right? And then the nonmetals are over to the right. All right, and then to name ionic compounds, we put the full name of the first element. So and then we add the base name of the second element. And with this part, right, we end the name of the second element with the ending IDE. Okay, so that's the second part. So you'll have one name, full name of the first element, and then you have the other part, the other word, which is the base name of the second element plus the ending of "ide." Okay? Now this case is for when you have a main group metal and one nonmetal. Now there is another case of an ionic compound, and that is when you have a transition metal and a nonmetal. Okay, so this is the first case, and this will be the second case. So, like earlier, you're going to see if a metal is a transition metal or a main group metal by looking at the periodic table. So the metals here, right, and here, those will be main group metals. The metals in the center, right, transition metals, will be all these here. All right, so to name a transition metal, the rule is, the first part is the same. You write the full name of the first element, okay, so you have the name there. Now it changes here. In parentheses, you will add the charge of the transition metal in parentheses, so whatever that is. The names are not written in brackets. I'm showing here so that you know that these are separate words. Okay, so you have the charge of the, let's put it here. You have the charge of the transition metal. And then for the second element, the nonmetal, will be the same as the first case, where you have the base name of the second element and the ending of "ide." And that's another word. Okay, so that's the second case when you have an ionic compound. Third case is when you have a metal and a polyatomic ion. So the polyatomic ions, you can look those up on the internet and see what comes up. Those are just combinations of elements. You want to know their charge and their formula. So when you have that, you'll name the polyatomic ion. So that will just be the complete name of the polyatomic ion. And then you have the name of the nonmetal. With the ending "-ide" here. Now normally the polyatomic ion will have a negative charge, so what you end up doing is you have the metal and you'll have the polyatomic ion. So for this case, you would write the full name of the metal, whether it's a transition metal or a main group metal, and you would apply the rules of whether you need to put the Roman numeral here. Okay, so if it's a transition metal here, you would write the full name of the metal, and then if it is a transition metal, you'll write the charge in Roman numerals. If it's a main group metal, you obviously will not put the Roman numerals here. And then after that, you have the full name of the polyatomic ion. Alright, so those are the rules for the ionic compounds. Now we also have the covalent compounds. You might also know them as molecular compounds. Okay, so covalent or molecular. So for these, you would use the prefixes that indicate the number of atoms of each element in a compound. So we want to really know those prefixes. So just put here. So mono indicates 1, right? Di, di, is 2. Tri is 3. Tetra is 4. Penta is for 5. And there's hexa for 6. And then we have hepta for 7. For 8. Nona for 9. And deca for 10. Okay, so to name a covalent compound, well, first let's see what a covalent or molecular compound is. So this will be made up of 2 nonmetals. Okay, so we know that this will be 2 nonmetals. Okay, so the elements, when you see a compound made up of elements only from the nonmetals, then you'll know that it's a covalent or molecular compound. Okay, so pay attention where the elements are so that you can know their type. So what happens here is that you'll have a nonmetal and another nonmetal. And what you will do is you will write, when appropriate, the prefix of the first element and then you will write the full name of the first element. And these are combined. So in one word, you'll have the prefix and the element's name. And so this will be one part. Okay. And then for the second element, you will have the prefix of the second element and you will have then the base name of the second element with the ending "-ide". Okay, and we will go over some examples so you can see this put into practice. So example number 1. Give the name of this compound. So the first step here is to know which elements we are dealing with from the symbols. Okay, so as we see here, we have Li and we have O. Okay, so if we look here on the periodic table, you can see that we have lithium here, and O is oxygen. Okay, so we have lithium and oxygen. And we have oxygen. All right, so then the next step is to identify which type of elements lithium and oxygen are. So once again, looking at the periodic table, we see here that lithium is a main group metal. Okay? And we see that oxygen here is a nonmetal. Right, so just to clarify, the groups 1, 2, 3, those metals will be main group elements. Okay, and they're main group metals specifically. Okay? All right, so from that, we know that we have a main group metal and a nonmetal. So what type of compound would this be? Would it be covalent or would it be ionic? Okay, so it would be ionic, and from earlier here, we see that we have to name the full name of the first element plus the base name of the second element with the ending "-ide". Okay, so how that works is that we have lithium, the full name of the first element, plus the base name of the second element So here, ox, and we have the ending "ide." Okay, so this compound's name is lithium oxide. And as you see, with ionic compounds, we do not have to put the subscript here into writing. Okay, so for our second example, so as we did with the first example, we need to identify which compounds we are dealing with. We have Na and we have Cl. And as you can see here, we have another main group metal plus a nonmetal. So once again, and the names here are sodium and chloride. Or chlorine. The chloride here is indicating the ionic form of chlorine. So as we did for the first example, we have the full name of the first element, so sodium, plus the base name of the second element, so chloride, with the ending IDE. Alright, so for our third example, we have this one. So once again, the elements are going to be these. And looking on the periodic table, we see that we have chromium and we have fluorine. Okay. So as we see from the periodic table, chromium is a transition metal. So in this case, we have to follow a slightly different rule. And fluorine is a nonmetal. So in this case, as we saw from earlier, we write the full name of the transition metal, so chromium. And because it is a transition metal, we have to place its charge in Roman numerals inside of these parentheses. So the charge of fluorine here is -1, okay? And we have 2 of them. So in total, we have a -2 charge from fluorine. And because the entire compound is neutral, right? Remember, when we see nothing up here in the top right corner, the entire compound is neutral. It has a 0 charge. Okay, so in this case, we know that -2 plus something, let's call it x, is going to total 0. So we know that if we put a +2 here, -2 plus 2 will be 0. So the charge of chromium is 2. Therefore, we put a Roman numeral 2 in the parentheses. And then for the next part, we have fluorine, and we know that we have to name its name the first part, the base name. So, and we have the ending "ide." So, fluoride. So the complete name of this compound is chromium 2 fluoride. Let's try another one of these. So example 4, we can do this one. So our elements, symbols are CO, that's a lowercase o, and N. From the periodic table, we know that CO represents cobalt, and N is nitrogen. Now, if we look at the periodic table, we can see that CO, cobalt, is a transition metal, and that nitrogen is a nonmetal. So we know that we have an ionic compound, and we know that we have a transition metal plus a nonmetal. So in that case, we know that we are going to have to put cobalt's charge in Roman numerals inside a parentheses. So we have here the complete name of the first element. So cobalt, we have parentheses. Okay, and so from the periodic table, we know that nitrogen, when it has an ionic charge, is -3. Now we do have two nitrogens, so -3 times 2 is 6, -6. So first we have the -6 plus whatever charge cobalt is, and that has to equal 0, because the entire compound here has a neutral charge. There is no number here telling us the charge in the upper right corner. So we know that X here, if we isolate it, or we add 6 to each side, we know that X has to be 6. So cobalt has to have a charge of 6. We put that in Roman numerals. And then here, for the second element, we have nitrogen. And we know we write its base name with the ending "ide", so nitride. And you'll get used to naming the nonmetal just by practicing. The more problems you do, the more familiar you will become with knowing which name the nonmetal has. Alright, so for the next example, we have PF5. So we know that P here is phosphorus. Okay. And we know that F is fluorine. So looking at the periodic table, we can tell that phosphorus and fluorine are both nonmetals. So in this case, we have two nonmetals. Right, so a nonmetal plus another nonmetal. And we know from our rules that this is going to be a covalent or molecular compound, and that we have to use the prefixes to indicate the number of atoms for each element. So in this case, when the first element is only one, right, there's only one of them, you don't put mono phosphorus. That is only for when the first element here has only one atom. If it had 2, 3, or more, you would have to put its prefix plus phosphorus, okay? But in this case, it's just phosphorus. We do not put the prefix for it because it is 1, and it is the first element. If when the second element has one atom, you do put mono, just not for the first one. Okay, so we have phosphorus, and then we know that we have to put the prefix of the second element, so we have 5 here. So we know that 5 was penta. So we have penta, and we know that we have fluorine, so we have to write fluorine's base name plus the ending "ide", so pentafluoride. Right, so the base name is here, fluor, and then the ending IDE. So the name of this compound would be phosphorus pentafluoride. So just as another example, for this one, we do the same steps. We identify the symbols, and we know that we have nitrogen and fluorine. So we know that nitrogen and fluorine are 2 nonmetals. So you have a nonmetal plus a nonmetal. So 2 nonmetals. And then we know that we have to put the prefix, right? Because we have 2 nonmetals, we have a covalent compound. Therefore, we do use prefixes. So for 2 here, we have to put the prefix for 2. So di, nitrogen. We write the full name of the first element. And then for the second, we have 4. So tetra is our prefix. And we have the element's name plus the ending IDE. So tetrafluoride. Dinitrogen tetrafluoride would be the name for this compound. Now, just for extra practice, we also have the case of when a polyatomic ion is involved. So for example, here, so this is the polyatomic ion, nitrate, okay? So nitrate is made up of nitrogen and oxygen of 3, so nitrate is made up of 1 nitrogen atom and 3 oxygen atoms, and its charge is -1. Alright, so that is the polyatomic ion, and as we see here, barium here is a metal. Okay, so we are dealing with this and this one. Okay, so this one is going to be nitrate, and this is barium. So we know that barium is a metal, and nitrate is our polyatomic ion. So for that, we know that we have to write the full name of the first element, so barium, and we have nitrate. So barium nitrate is this compound's name. We follow the ionic compound rules, and we put the full name of the metal. And for the second part, the polyatomic ion, we put it the full polyatomic ion's name. We don't add the ending "ide." So this ending for polyatomic ions, we don't do. Okay, now the metal here can also be a transition metal. So what if we had this? So here, I'll just put in parentheses. It might not be written in parentheses, so you'll have to know that PO4, and it has a -3 charge alone, is a polyatomic ion, right? Because this, they don't have to tell you. They can just put here that. And you'll have to know that this part is the polyatomic ion. So in this case, we know that Fe is iron, and that PO4 is phosphate. Looking at the periodic table, we can see that iron is a transition metal, which means that we have to add its charge in Roman numerals inside a parentheses. So we first write the full name of the first element, which is iron, and we have its charge here. So we only have one phosphate, and one phosphate has a -3 charge. So we have a -3 plus the charge of iron, which I'll call X, is supposed to add up in total to be 0, right? So remember, when we see nothing up here in the top right corner, the compound or the element has a neutral charge. It's 0. So here, -3 plus 3 would be 0. So we know that X is +3. So we'll write +3 in Roman numerals here. Okay, so the charge of iron in this case will be +3. And because we have a polyatomic ion next, we just write the full name of the polyatomic ion. So iron 3 phosphate is the name of this compound. Right, so we just have to find out what the charge is of the transition metal, because kind of from the name you can tell that the charge of a transition metal varies. Iron could be +2, it could be +3, depending on which element it is paired up with. So in the end, pay attention to which elements you are dealing with, and whether they are a metal or a non-metal. And if it's a metal, is it a main group metal or is it a transition metal? And then follow the rules accordingly. And then if you have a polyatomic ion, well, first of all, know your polyatomic ions, know the ones that your instructor wants you to know for sure, and know that you have to write its full name and that you do not use the ending IDE with polyatomic ions. All right, and for covalent compounds, know that you have to use the prefix and to indicate how many atoms of that element you have. And that's the only time you're going to use prefixes for these cases, is when you have a covalent compound, not when you have an ionic compound. That's an important thing to take into account, because it will mess you up if you start adding prefixes when you have ionic compounds. So I really hope you enjoyed this video. Thank you for watching, and don't forget to subscribe if you are new.